Hi, everyone, and welcome back to For the Curious and Confused, a podcast for people who want to understand different perspectives of the world through the people who inhabit it. I'm your host, Dominic Taggart, and today I'm joined by Dane Wagner. Dane is an organizational psychologist, serial entrepreneur, and speaker. He works with venture capitalists and entrepreneurs to help them improve individual, team, and organizational performance. With over a decade of experience in data analytics and user experience research, he has contributed to industry understanding on topics such as loss prevention, behavior modification, employee satisfaction, and designs for neurodivergency. He's also an active adjunct faculty at Florida International University, giving lectures and workshops on topics such as personnel selection, research methods, psychometrics, and the psychology of entrepreneurship. I'm really excited to hear more about your insights on how individual and group behaviors overlap or don't when aimed at common goals. So thanks for sharing your time with us today, Dane.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I'm super excited to be here.
So to start us off, could you give us a 2-minute introduction into who Dane Wagner is and what motivates him?
Yeah, of course. So I am ultimately a curious teacher, right? I think if I had to choose two attributes to refer to myself, that's really all it comes down to. I'm a curious teacher, right? I've spent, as you said in your little intro there, I've spent a lot of time learning and investigating, researching all sorts of things from how the brain works, how products are designed, how entrepreneurs interact with each other. And so, what's always driven me and what's always kind of pushed me is simply wanting to know more information and then share that information with others, right? So, that's me in a nutshell right there, a curious teacher.
When did you first realize you wanted to share that information also? Because I feel like a lot of people can resonate with the being curious about stuff, but I feel like the teacher
Mhm.
part is not necessarily as widespread. So how old were you? Was it a certain moment when you're like, I gotta let other people know what this is about?
Actually, it goes all the way back to probably elementary school, primary school, where I was starting to learn music theory, right? My older sister was a percussionist, and she would practice, and I'd watch, and she'd teach me a little bit here and there about what music really was and how it all worked together and how to do polyrhythms, etc., how to practice, grow. And so when I go to school, I'd get my friends and I'd be like, look what I just learned. And I'd teach them essentially how to become a percussionist and how to read rhythms and how to play music. And going into music class, I'd spend extra time there teaching. And that was the start of it all, right? It was being able to share something cool that I didn't think everybody had an opportunity to learn.
That's a great answer. So can you do like the 1, 2, 3 tap on like one hand and like the 4 tap on one
Yes, I
hand and like the
can.
5 and 6 on the left and right foot? Those I've seen videos of that. That's
Yep.
very impressive. So that's super cool.
I I was actually a, studio percussionist for a little while, probably about 3, 4 years, and that was one of the first things that I was asked to do. Funny enough, by a band that was questioning my capabilities, etc. They're like, "Hey, so can you do this?" And I was like, "Oh, yes, I can. I can even
Get
go
ready.
on just my fingers. I can do one. I can do whole notes on one, half notes on another, quarter notes on one, eighth notes on another, and sixteenths on another, all at
Oh,
one time."
man, you musicians are a different breed. That's super
Yeah,
impressive.
yeah,
One other thing that kind of a tangent on that, but similar of a silly idea. I saw on your LinkedIn that you used to
yeah.
teach parkour and calisthenics
Hmm.
also. So how did you get into that, and what do you think we can learn from calisthenics?
Oh, for sure. That was actually my first venture, right? It was my first company that I ended up making. And cool thing, a little side note there is that it was what kind of ignited my passion for entrepreneurship while we're at it. But getting into that was an interesting story. I was hanging out at school in high school, and I saw some guy jump over a railing at school, and he did it in the what we would call a Kong, right? Which is the way where it's that cliche parkour style jump where they're facing forward, they reach their hands forward, they pull the railing underneath them, and they just launch themselves over it, right?
So
And it
both the
looked
legs go between the arms. Is that
exactly,
okay? Yep,
yeah.
yep. Just make sure I got the visual.
Um,
Yeah.
Yeah, and it looked so cool, right? It was mind-blowing, and they did it off like a little bit of a height too. And I immediately was like, whoa, 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 hold on, what was that? What did you just do, right? Because that was the first time I'd
Mm,
ever seen that. And he said, "Oh, that's just a Kong, it's no big deal. I do parkour, blah blah blah." And I was like, "You do what now?" And so we built this relationship where really the only thing that we had in common, because he was a senior at that school and I was a sophomore at the school at the time, um, was that he knew how to move his body in a way that I wanted to learn, right? And I had already been doing martial arts for a little bit. So that was something where I was like, oh, that's the next step, right? Like, that's so cool. So, learned it there and started following suit with the curious and teaching, right? And started teaching it to other people. Found out that it could become a business, essentially. And to answer that second part, I mean, what can't you learn from it? It just like any sort of physical discipline, there's that word that I just used there, discipline, right? You learn how to do something you don't necessarily want to do, or even don't necessarily think you actually can do,
mm,
right? And there's always these obstacles, and I think parkour is more appropriate to it too, because it's the art of moving through obstacles, right? Seeing obstacles and moving around them, over them in a fluid manner. So it really teaches you that mentality, that agile mentality of, hey, if there's something in front of me, it's not a true obstruction, right? I can get around that. I can get over that. It might take a little longer, but there's a way to get around this obstacle with the least amount of effort, the least amount of impact on the time of the goal that I have, etc. So that's if there's any one thing to take away from it, it's that, right? It's being able to look at obstacles a different way.
That's very interesting because I thought the direction you were going to go was about being aware, more aware of like each part of your body in terms of like
Hmm.
knowing that you
Like
have to move it a certain
proprioception.
way. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but that's the interesting of the awareness of obstacles more so than the proprio awareness part.
Hmm.
Um, that's very cool. And I guess martial arts is probably also very proprio aware as well.
Very much. There's some of the arts that I've done. I did one called Wing Chun, right? Which was popularized primarily by a lot of kung fu movies. If you've ever seen Ip Man, that's something Bruce Lee had learned that art and brought it. And so when I was learning that there's a practice that involves kind of holding your arms against each other, it's sticky hands, right? And
Mm,
so you are pressing your arms against somebody else's arms standing in front of you. And as they move their arms, they're trying to gain a position that's above yours. And you're trying to move your arms to gain a position above theirs. But you're not allowed to break hands, pretty much, right? The art is to be able to move your hands when you feel them move theirs, right? To stop them from getting the um, top position. And
mm,
so that kind of practice, while that's more or less found almost exclusively in Wing Chun, there's a lot of different arts that take that concept of being very aware of where you are in space, but also whatever actions are happening against your body and
mm.
reacting to them in a smooth way. So if you do like BJJ, for instance, there's rolling practices where as they're moving, you're moving to stop them. But it's all about staying fluid, all about continuing the motion throughout everything you're doing.
So the obstacles are the other people instead of
Yeah,
just the
exactly. We're
poles.
back to the
Yeah,
obstacles.
yeah, yeah. So that's a I think some good brief glancing into some other chapter of your life. If you were to divide your life into different chapters, which do you think have been the most impactful in how you approach life?
Hmm, that's actually a really good question. And my chapters are interesting, I would say, perhaps, because one of my chapters was I was adopted at the age of 16, and not in the traditional way. I was actually removed from my family or my birth parents at the age of 3, right? And I was living with my aunt all that time, and it took a while due to various uh, issues, right, with paperwork and stuff to get me finally adopted. But I was essentially a ward of the state for all that time until she was actually officially able to adopt me around the age of 16. But the first chapter opens with that transition, right? Which is that at a very early age, I went to live somewhere else completely with very different people. I had very different experiences. I went from a place that spoke English almost exclusively to a place that suddenly had a bunch of Spanish being spoken, right?
That was
The
your
Cuban
aunt?
language. Yeah. Well, my aunt does speak really fluent Spanish, but she was from Chicago. So, but we lived in Miami, Florida.
Mm.
So it was, one of the early times was looking at this world, and she was like, "Oh shit, is this kid gonna like Spanish food? Like is it gonna be okay? Like is he just gonna reject everything I like eating right now?" Um
Mm.
Spoiler alert, I did not. I loved all food. I loved food. But so that's like that first chapter, right? That first transition and recognizing and being taught and brought up that she wasn't my mother, but she was my mother, right? And having that sort of dissonance there of being aware that, hey, everybody, when they talk about their parents, talk about it one way, but when I talk about my parents, I have to talk about it a different way, right?
Mm.
And so the first chapter was being brought up and recognizing that my own mental model was different than everybody else's. The next chapter was probably um, going into middle school. And middle school is where I started making more of a personal, distinctive. I'm going to use like fancy entrepreneurial terms here, but like brand, right? It's my brand.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
recognizing that I was going to be that kid who stood up for what was right, but also wanted to share the dumbest information with anybody and everybody, right? And so I had just before leaving elementary school, I had read the entirety of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It was they had it at my school, the 1960s one, and I took every volume, and every day I was going there reading it because I volunteered at the library. So what else was I going to do with some of my spare time? But for some reason, like just reading about facts really made me happy at that time. So, um, cue me going into middle school and realizing that there's a lot of random things that people don't know and things that they could know if they were just given the opportunity, right? Nobody's going to go pick up the encyclopedia and start reading it. That's a really weird thing to do. And so I was that kid that could. So my second chapter was probably exploring how others were open to learning new things and how to even bring this information to them in a way where they could learn that it wasn't just facts because nobody likes learning at school. So why would they want to learn from another kid? But ra rationalizing essentially and recognizing the fact that it's because of how people were learning that they didn't like school, right? It's the culture of the school, the expectation of school, and that you could teach them anything if you just knew what excited them about that. So that was chapter two. Chapter three, not to spend too much time on this concept here, right? But chapter three probably going on to like leaving high school, going into college, right? And exploring what was I really going to be doing. By that time, I had an amazing professor, my our professor teacher. He was my psychology teacher, Dr. Hamlin, and he did something no other teacher ever did before. And I mentioned, I at an early age I read through the entirety of the Encyclopedia Britannica, whatever, blah blah blah. I was kind of a smart kid at the time, right? And so I coasted by a lot. I didn't really try very hard. It's kind of that standard gifted story, whatever. But one day in my psychology class, he looks me square in the eye and he says, "You didn't read, did you?" And I was like, no. And he didn't wait for me to get out of my chair. He just took the desk with me in it and dragged me outside of the classroom, put the textbook on the chair, and said, "You're going to read this if you want to stay in this class." And then just left me out in the hallway.
There's a way to engage somebody in the learning process. That
Let
is,
me tell you, yeah, it was mind blowing, and it really woke me up because I was like, oh man, I don't try, right? Like I just really take what I can get, but I don't really try. And that changed my life forever, right? Because when I went into college, I realized, oh yeah, none of these teachers here are really caring about me, right? None of them are caring about the individual. They have in some of my classes, they have 300 students. Like, there's no way they're going to care about me. I have to try. I have to do what Mr. Hamlin, what Dr. Hamlin was telling me to do. So that was that next chapter of recognizing that I have autonomy, I have capability, and I have agency that I need to imbue in myself. And this was all happening while I was still doing teaching parkour. I was also starting to do Door and Lending Library at this time, where I had met my lovely now wife at the time. And this was 13 years ago now. And so we had met, and she loved reading. She loved all this kind of like really cool stuff about games and reading and learning. And I also loved that. And we were fortunate enough to have kind of created this network where we could access all these things, games, tools, books, etc., and the knowledge to best leverage them. And so we started Dorian Lending Library, which was a mix of both of our names, Dane and Lauren. And we created this little lending library where at first we were pretty much being middlemen, right? If you needed this, we'd source it from someone else and go get it, etc. But then it became over the years, and I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but over the years, it became a physical location at FIU where we had a warehouse, and it was filled with all this stuff, and we had volunteers and all this. It was a really cool system, right? Where we're pairing people with the knowledge they needed. If you needed to fix your deck, you could go learn how to fix your deck and get the tools to fix the deck all in one place. It was really wonderful. But that kind of was the start of that chapter, right? Of being able to make these meaningful connections and leverage my own agency and help others in a way that I couldn't have done before, right? That was not something I could have done back in high school, back in middle school, back in elementary school. And then the final chapter, let's just scoop, jump all the way over here, which is that it's the one where I have my master's degree and I have my further education, and I'm able to not just be another member in the workforce like I was for a while I was working on Dorian Lending Library, while I was working with the Aeon Porcar and Miami Parkour. I was also teaching at high school. I was teaching maths and science at a high school. I was a data analytics specialist. I was a learning and development specialist for a different company. I got to do all these other things in a more traditional corporate, uh, you know, manner. And that next chapter was me going, but I don't want to, right? Like one, I don't want to, but two, there's so many problems that I, as an employee, had to deal with, ranging from, a manager that came and had no idea what they were doing and had other employees doing their managerial workload for them, right? All the way to systems that just were very redundant and didn't make sense and were like inefficient, right? And as an employee, I didn't have the power, right, to go fix those things. So that final chapter is me gaining that power, me getting the credentials and the experience to be able to go, hey, I'm going to start some meta behavior science. I'm going to work not with these big companies anymore, which I had a little stint consulting with these larger companies, but recognizing that they're not there really to fix the problems when they're a big company. They're not really there to dedicate the time and effort to really help the employees most of the time. Instead, what would be useful is going to the source when these companies start and giving them the tools to make sure that those problems never even happen in the first place, right? So it started working with other entrepreneurs, giving them experience that I myself experienced, right? But also tying that in with the scientific and academic learning that I got to do. So that final chapter is kind of where I am today. It's ever growing, ever evolving, and it's leveraging my experience and capabilities in yet another more professional way than I ever could before.
That's a great precursor, I think, for some of the juicier topics we're getting into. But one last framing
Sure.
question for everyone to bring all this on together. How do you feel like your personal strengths and weaknesses have influenced that path and where you are now?
Mm. Um, well, I think that my curiosity has, and it almost sounds like one of those things that you would say at like a job interview, like, "Oh, my greatest weakness is my strongest strength." No, but my curiosity has been kind of a problem in the past, right? It's where I'll get distracted by an issue and want to focus on that and learn more about it, even when maybe the time isn't right now to do that, right? I know, for instance, thinking back when I was a data analyst, there were, you know, being a data analyst is basically being a problem solver. It's being a puzzle solver. They give you problems. They say, hey, we need a model to create blah, 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 and predict blah, blah, blah. And you're there trying to figure out how to use all these variables to get the appropriate answer, make it as efficient as possible, and then convey the right information after the fact. Um, but I would get so lost in how deep some of this information went and be like, oh, but what does this lead to? And what does that lead to? To the
Every
point where
variable
I'd
had its
have,
own literature on
yeah,
it. Yeah.
exactly. Um, and when you're a researcher, that's one thing. It helps. You're doing, let's say you're doing a lit review, and yeah, cool. Go find every paper out there and every document out there that taps into this and make a thorough lit review. But when you're doing the actual application and the applied work, it was a problem for sure, right? I'd
Mhm.
get distracted a lot, and that's one thing, right? It's definitely a little issue. I'd end up over-engineering solutions sometimes with all that information too. But as far as positives and strengths that I have, I'd probably have to go with like systematic thinking, right? Systems thinking, and being able to see all these different pieces and all these different parts and hold them all actively in my mind and in the project at the same time. See how they all fit and interact, and as one changes, see how that cascades into changing the other aspects. That's helped me a lot when it comes to organizational development stuff, right? Where there's a lot of variables from external stakeholders, internal stakeholders. Um, you have things like tenure and turnover and all this stuff of just the people alone, let alone the other components that happen, such as revenue streams and sales and marketing. And, there's a lot of variables that all happen at once. And if you change one of them, all of them actually end up changing a little bit. So I've been able to really leverage that systems thinking pretty effectively in that manner. Um, yeah, I'd say that's probably my biggest strength there.
Yeah. So with all of those systems, which have all those interlocking variables and can be, I'm imagining, modeled in some very mathematical way, how do you bring these into, or what are sort of the challenges that emerge from those systems that you're trying to help people and organizations address in what you do?
Yeah. So all those problems and all those variables come together, and they they come together to influence anything and everything in an organization, right? And so when we're talking about how to use them and leverage them to help people, that's a much more complex question than maybe it seems at surface level, because I'll tell you, I've had somebody come over and say, "Hey, I have this one position, and it's just crazy turnover in this one position. What's going on here, right? We have three tiers of positions essentially, and this middle position is just not retaining anybody. They'll stick around for like 2 months, 3 months, and then leave. What's going on? Can you fix their engagement?" And when they're asking that kind of question, they're typically looking at just that area, right? They're looking at that single position. They're going, all right, let's fix this single position. But what they don't typically realize is that in order to fix that position, we oftentimes have to adjust or manipulate the other positions, other maybe strategic decisions that are being made with the company, other external and internal factors with this company that need to be adjusted to best help this single position stop having this negative outcome, right? And whether that's a CWB, which is counterproductive work behaviors, right? There are things like checking out withdrawal kind of thing, or maybe stealing at the workplace, like, counterproductive work behaviors vary pretty widely, but they're things we want to prevent in the workplace. So, what we typically do for us at Semeta, right, is we will look at the three components when helping companies. We'll look at the external shareholders, we'll look at the internal shareholders, and we'll look at the para support group. And the para support group being typically like coaches or advisors, right? the Because we work largely with startups and investors, those external shareholders are typically the investors, and the internal shareholders are typically like the founders of the teams. And so we will kind of balance the traits that those founders are bringing into the table, right? So I talked about myself with systems thinking. We'll look at if they are systems thinking or part thinking, right? If they are maybe perhaps highly collaborative or very individualistic, if those founders maybe even are what their recovery period is like after they have a serious setback. Are they Do they have a more gradual recovery? Do they have a quick recovery? All of these things impact how they communicate and how they behave, how they act, etc., with projects internally, but also how they interact with the investors. And the investors, we have to help align their goals with what is capable and possible from the founders, right? The investors, usually 9 times out of 10, are typically just trying to ensure that their investment, the money that they put into this company, is going to come back at a certain ROI, right? They want something like 3 times ROI at least. Um, that's very vague when it comes down to things, because as a founder, you're like, I want my company to succeed, but what does success really mean? The investor's going, well, it means you should be getting me 3 times as much money as I put into your company. And that's not very specific. That's not very directive, right? It's make money, sell, and get me that money. But what does that mean really when it comes to sustainable company practices, hiring the right people, structuring projects, etc.? That's really vague. So we are that intersection between those two, where we help the investor understand the fit that they're looking for, and the founders understand the fit that they're trying to establish with each other. And then we empower the coaches to come in and make that work happen over time, right? With the right kind of information, we have assessments, for instance, that we utilize to capture these variables that are all over the place, to best help the founders and investors work together.
Mhm. As a very rough figure, how would you assign the contribution of individual personality versus kind of, I guess, patterns of how the business is set up as the things that contribute to I guess to give the example of the high turnover in that middle position,
Mhm.
um, is it more individual personalities that are influencing everything, or is it a bigger system problem within how this company's set up on a ratio kind of basis?
Right. So I'm going to reframe that question a little bit and point
Mm-hmm.
to a more model-centric structure, and say, there's concepts, and I'm not sure if the audience necessarily is super aware of these words, but I'm going to say moderating and mediating variables. Moderating variables are ones that will adjust how severely a different variable will affect something. And a mediating variable is kind of like the path in which one variable affects another, right? So when we're looking at this kind of question, I want to reframe that and say that the traits that people are bringing in, the personality that people are bringing in, are kind of the first step to the mediating variable problem, right? The When we're talking about success and effectiveness and those avoiding those counterproductive work behaviors, the mediating variable between the traits and the those outcomes is basically going to be the structure and actions. We kind of call them styles, right? So it's going to be the working styles, the thinking styles, the socio-emotional styles that people rely on in the company to manage the company and get the company flowing to complete these projects, etc. So it's not that it necessarily does some percentage or some ratio of everything. It's more so that they're the underlying mechanism that influences all that other stuff.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Very cool. In the interest of time, I'm gonna drop that nice little tidbit and move on to
Sure.
another one. But because I see a rabbit hole that we could very easily get really far down in. So my next question is, what is burnout? What causes it, and how can we navigate through it?
Love that question. And it's so vital to talk about that too at any stage, whether, the entrepreneurial stage or the enterprise stage or even, academic stage, right? Um, I think what a lot of people will consider burnout is just like being tired, right? Like, oh, I'm so exhausted, I'm really burnt out. But we have to recognize that burnout is more complex than that, as it's a psychological um, complex construct here in effect that involves, yes, the physical exhaustion, but also emotional exhaustion and depersonalization, feelings of accomplishment. Um, these are areas of burnout that are invasive and sort of sneaky because it builds up over time. Yeah, you're tired and you'll be like, all right, cool. Yeah, I'm tired. I'm exhausted, but let me do this work anyway. And over time, you start realizing that you're checking out of work a little bit. You're not caring about it as much. The impact, things outside of work aren't bringing you the same joy that they used to bring. Um, and it's really dangerous because, yeah, burnout will lead to all sorts of things like chronic physical um, outcomes such as pains and aches and inabilities to move, etc. They result in resource scarcity, which is going to be something that is sometimes physical resources, right? You're not performing as well when you're burnt out, so you're not gathering the same physical resources that you used to. But it also is mental resources. I'll take a little aside real quick and mention there's a concept that we often bring up with people who are starting to experience burnout, and we call it the spoon theory. It was something that we saw long, long ago on Tumblr, of all places, way, way back in the day. But it was someone talking about how their energy levels are essentially spoons in a drawer. And every time they need to do a task, they take a spoon out. And they need to recognize that they need to allow themselves time to wash the spoons and put them back in the drawer. If they don't, at some point there's just not going to be any spoons left, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So we sort of jokingly bring that into play and when talking about burnout because we need to remember that everybody has a cooldown. Earlier I talked about how some entrepreneurs, for instance, they'll have a fast recovery or a more gradual recovery. You need to recognize that in yourself and let yourself have the time to replenish those spoons in the drawer if you need it. There's a lot of strategies that go into that. Everything's very personalized with your motivations and what works for you might not work for someone else, for instance. But typically, the big trick to it is separating yourself from the thing that's burning you out. So if it's work that's burning you out explicitly, you need to go find something that removes work from the equation, distracts you from work. I did some research some time ago on micro breaks and leveraging micro breaks in the workplace. And what we found was the micro breaks that were taken at your desk were less effective and less impactful than the micro breaks that were taken away from your desk, right? When you go on a short little like walk outside and then come back in, cool, that had a much better impact on rejuvenating you and bringing more energy to the table and helping you think clearer than hopping on your phone for a little bit while still sitting at your desk, right?
Mm-hmm.
You'd think you were checking out, but it turns out not really because you were still in the same environment. You weren't really able to fully remove yourself from the workplace. So when push comes to shove, whatever you are choosing to do, hopefully something healthier, not necessarily unhealthy. One of my students, for instance, was joking about how, if we keep talking about finding ways to cope with stress, we might get into the heavy drug use and alcohol usage world. And it's like, yeah, maybe I shouldn't be recommending whatever works for you per se, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's, be healthy, whether it's exercise, etc. Everything's in moderation regardless. And you just need to find a way of separating yourself from the work to be able to combat that kind of burnout. The other thing I will say one more thing here is that it can help to vary up your workplace and your work tasks. So instead of doing the same thing over and over again, I mentioned earlier, for instance, the idea of like research, right? If you're doing a lit review, that can be very exhausting and tiring. I'm sure I don't have to tell you that it is awful sometimes. You end up having like 50 tabs open and all these different articles and you're going through them and you're trying to track where each reference is coming from and what you're doing with it and putting it together. But you can sometimes spend days, weeks. I've spent literally months on one before, just because there was so much information out there and things kept evolving very quickly. But it's the idea of don't just do that thing every day, right? Come into work and recognize that, okay, hold on. If there's 3 tasks that I have to do, I'm not going to just do this one task until completion and then do the next, right? The waterfall effect. Be more agile with it. Do this a little bit one day and then do another task another day. Break it up. And if you're doing that, you're going to at least feel a little bit less loaded with your cognitive processes, and it should help prevent the drain of battery, removing the spoon so quickly, if you will.
Mm-hmm. I like that analogy. It also makes me imagine this idea of like if you're taking a spoon out for a relatively simple task, if there are no
Mhm.
spoons available, you have to first wash that spoon before you can do the simple task. And this is just from personal experience. I can imagine that
Mhm.
you say this should be a task that doesn't take much effort, but it feels like it takes a lot of effort, and that is because you have to wash a spoon first, also before do the task. So
Yes.
the analogy can go, I'm sure, many different directions,
Love
and
it.
I really like it. Okay, another pivot again in the interest of time.
Sure, sure.
So,
Yeah, yeah.
what are your thoughts on the idea that the most capable leaders are the ones who don't seek leadership? Does that have any
Mm.
validity for you, or what have you seen in your experiences?
Sure. So that's actually a really well-researched area. It's called emergent leadership characteristics, right? Where
Mm-hmm.
we will even go so far as to put people in situations when testing them where nobody's been assigned a leadership role. and we see who becomes the leader in that position, right? And is it the person who endorsed themselves as like, yeah, I'm always going to be the leader, people look to me, etc. Or is it going to be the person who's kind of more quiet and shy, but is genuinely capable, right? Truth is, it's kind of a 50-50 there. It's not necessarily that leaders that don't seek the leadership are better, but they do spend a lot of time building some characteristics in a informal capacity that can lead to a more comfortable leadership style, right? When we talk about leadership styles, there's all sorts. I mean, literally, it kind of depends on who you ask and what they want to call it. But there's transformative leadership styles, et cetera, that are out there and kind of discuss the concept of how do you approach the people you're leading, right? How do you talk to them? How do you introduce projects or problems or tasks to them? And how do you guide them through it? Are you trying to get something out of them? Are you trying to give them something? What's going on? So when we talk about leaders that don't technically seek out leadership, the big the strength, right, is that they can have those informal skills that kind of have built up really well. The downside is leadership is a skill. And so if you're not practicing that skill, if you're not developing that skill, then you're at a disadvantage, right? It's kind of like speaking with people or any other kind of aspect. The more you do it, the better at it you typically become. Now, obviously, there's caveats to that when it comes to leadership. I've had leaders, for instance, that have been in a leadership position for 30 years, and I did not want them to be my leader, right? They were not
Mhm.
effective, but that's also partially an age thing, a cultural thing, et cetera, right? There's other variables to bring into the place. So I can't say, uh, you know, a with a strong affirmative manner that those who don't seek leadership are any better than those who do. There's areas that they're better at, there's areas that they're not better at, and it depends on a lot of characteristics, essentially. As we in psychology often say, it depends.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, I think it's fun to ask very black and white questions because there is never a black and white answer, and it's
Yeah.
always to see what shade of gray is what comes out from that.
I
So
love it.
the yeah, three more questions for you.
Yeah,
What is
sure.
your favorite and least favorite part of what you do?
My favorite part is the exploration of new things, right? Every project that I've ever done in this area that I'm in has not been the same, right? It's never the same thing. They might even ask for the same thing, but it's never the same way to get to the solution.
And
So
to interrupt really quickly on that, sorry, is that about the industry that you're in or the types of problems within similar industries?
a little bit of
Or
both.
both? A little both. Got it.
Definitely a little bit of both, right? The industry of entrepreneurship, right, is very much trying to push innovation and agile thinking and moving quickly, right?
Mm.
So the problems that they engage with and how they're trying to attack those problems is a little different than your traditional enterprise solutions, right? Your more corporate level solutions. You have to move at a different pace. You have to move in a different way. You have to find more creative solutions to it because, at the very least, a big difference that often happens is you're addressing smaller groups, right? When I fix a problem, or let's not maybe say a problem per se, but when I create an intervention that targets a single founder in a team, affecting that founder and improving that founder pays such a larger percent of ROI than if I were doing the same intervention for a single person in a team that was part of a company of 40,000 people, right? It's because what the founder does every decision they make and every action they take directly impacts the entire company versus someone in a, 40,000 person company might not actually impact the entire company at all. They could sometimes even, and it's an unpopular opinion, but sometimes they could just disappear and nothing really changes in the company, right? So it's about that ability to look at these new problems and try to be creative and innovative with solving them and also educate them at the same time about it, right? Get them that awesome learning and capability to make sure to future-proof themselves. Um, the downside of all this, right? The downside of what I do is I just sort of joking, not jokingly, but I did just talk about the education aspect. But the downside is the education aspect. And it's because what we do and what we target and what we bring in is scientific validated, right? We're data-driven decision makers. We are everybody in my company has a PhD or a master's in industrial organizational psychology. We live and breathe this stuff. We know what works, what doesn't. When you're talking to these investors, for instance, about how important it is to look at the human traits, and what we call human capital, right? The KSAOs and traits that people bring into the table, and how those all kind of impact things a little bit stronger than some of the other things they actually look at, which, they'll a lot of investors will look for a stereotype of sorts. They'll look for that middle-aged white guy from an Ivy League school with a lot of money, right? And they'll say, "Oh, that guy can do it," right? And that's
Mhm.
because historically, yeah, that's pretty true, right? Historically speaking, the big companies have been founded by those kind of people. Um, but we're also not in that kind of world anymore, right? Like it was different. Allowances for people to have opportunities back then, and now it's different, right? We're a more globalized society, we have different cultures, etc. So when we talk about the value of looking at these concepts and incorporating into their data analytics and their onboarding and their due diligence, right? We call it psychological due diligence. Um, it's hard to convince them, right? You can show them the proof, the data, etc., and they'll sit there going, "Yeah, but that's only what a sample size of, 30,000 has shown. What about these four companies that I just grabbed and they were successful?" It's like, come
It's
on,
not the point.
right?
It's not the
Yeah.
point. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
So that's the hard part, right?
yeah.
That's sort of downside. It's sometimes talking to a wall to teach them how valuable and how important what we do is.
hmm I mean, yeah, there's a reason that people say that changing behavior is like the hardest thing to do on anybody. You can have all the data that is supporting it, backing it up, but
Hmm.
yeah, move another obstacle, jumping over that
Yeah.
obstacle of
There you
getting the
go.
behavior to change. It all comes back together. So again, talking about the transitioning from older periods of time into now newer periods of time.
Hmm.
What do you think are the most important ways that AI will impact society? Um,
Mm.
maybe either with just within your space or in the larger scope of things, and any sort of thoughts that come out of your brain for that.
That's a great question to ask me right now because just signed over a copy of a chapter that's going out in a edited volume about IO and AI, right?
Mm,
AI being used in IO psychology practices and utilizations to solve the problems we're trying to solve, for instance. And I've also written, other chapters on text analysis and LLMs and all that stuff around. So I love AI, right? I truly love everything that it's been doing. Well, maybe not everything, but the capabilities that it's opened up has been innumerable. The discourse around it is questionable, and some people think AI can do a lot more than what it actually can do, and some people maybe have different plans and expectations for it. So I'll talk from my personal view. It's not the like, word on high or anything like that, but it's my expertise from a scientific area and having I was I was building an LLM as part of my graduate uh, work, and it was the year before ChatGPT dropped 3.0, which was their most popular update, right? When they shifted to 3.0, it suddenly was in everybody's hands. Before that, it seemed like people were just talking about AI willy-nilly, but it was when they that happened, it, like changed the world, right? So I can say for a fact that AI is going to do a lot of really good things, right? It makes things a lot faster for us. It allows automations to happen a lot easier. It's going to change product development in a way that's been unprecedented. It already is doing that, right? People are able to push forward products that they never could before, test them in ways they never could before. My favorite thing about AI is honestly the text analytics area, right? You can take this qualitative information, which is just text data, and run it through and get thematic analyses. You can get all sorts of these super deep and previously highly time consuming and specialized analyses in seconds, right? And that means that as somebody who comes from like a strong UX background, that's awesome, right? Like that's so cool to be able to even do, take things like this podcast and you can run all the transcripts through it and get data out of it that you would have to have taken months to have done and had to have validated with other people who were trained to do it and verify things like coding thing. So the coolest thing is going to be how that impacts still how people are learning new ways to do that. We use our own like RAG model, for instance, in our developments where we take the insights that are numerical data and we've fed this RAG model all of our text, all of our research, which is, 30 years, 30 plus years of research that we've done combined between us. And we fed it all these research papers, and it's able to pull information out based on that and give you text-based insights, right? Like a coach would, right then and there in the report. So when we're going to help people, we can give them essentially learning that they can do on their own. They can start working on things without waiting for us to have a meeting with them, right? And that's huge. That means that the consulting sphere, for instance, the traditional consulting sphere and coaching sphere, is going to be very different next year, let alone what it became this year, let alone what it was last year, right? So that alone is huge. I see investors spending a lot of money on new AI models, new AI tools all the time, right? We look at YC, for instance, one of the more popular ones in the US, Y Combinator, and they're almost exclusively investing and bringing on AI-based founders and such. But when we're talking about like founders, for instance, I don't think there's a single founder that I've interacted with that doesn't use AI to help enhance and or create their products, even when they're in the physical space. There's a dude that sells pickles. He made his own brand of pickles. He does it in a different way, in a strategic way, and he's trying to make it like sort of a family brand style pickle. It's a physical product. It doesn't really need AI, one would think, but he has AI help with the marketing campaigns and with the structuring and how to make pitches to investors, and it's worked. It gave him some great ideas, and he's been doing fantastic jobs. So there's a lot of awesome opportunities uh, in the entrepreneurial space as well as the IO space, right? The consulting space, et cetera. For AI, I just will end this by saying it's not going to evolve as fast as people are saying it's going to evolve, right? There's only so much that we can do with a black box. And I say that in saying that we know theoretically how LLMs work, but if you follow research from like say Anthropic and what they're doing with just a different world to be in.
Yeah, I think we lost you for about 10 seconds there, but
I was gonna say, I
that's
think I saw you freeze there a little bit.
yeah,
It's
that's
a
okay.
different world.
We'll
That's the
leave that
point.
up to the audience's imagination for for what happened there.
Yeah.
Okay, one last question. You've been very generous with your time. Really appreciate it. So to
Of
finish us
course.
off, what is a piece of advice that is important to you that you could leave us with?
Hmm. Um, I think my let me think on that for a moment.
Mm?
I think that the biggest piece of advice that I can ever give anybody is that you are one variable in a world of variables, and so is everybody else, right? So, what I mean by that is when you say something, when you act a certain way, when you make a decision, you need to remember that that's not in a vacuum, right? It's in a world of interacting components and variables, right? The system that I alluded to before. Um, Recognizing this will enhance your ability to communicate effectively because you'll avoid the communicative gap, the perceptual gap that happens where you'll say, to borrow from Alice in Wonderland a little bit, say what you mean and mean what you say is not the same thing, right?
Mm.
But you'll also be able to enhance the fact that your expectations are going to be more realistic, knowing that when you do something, let's say it's a project that you're trying to complete, whenever you take an action there, it's influencing other things, but there's still so many different areas that are going to influence that. You can't know for sure at any point what's going to happen, really, right? Everything's ultimately a prediction, but you can make more effective predictions knowing that there's so many variables and being able to look at those variables, catalog them, use them to your advantage. So
Mhm.
that would be my advice. Remember that you're part of a system.
That's a great one. Yeah, I feel like it's very easy to operate as if I mean, we are the center of the universe in our own universe, which is good.
Yeah,
You want to be the hero of your story, but also
right.
there's a lot of other heroes and a lot of other stories as well. So,
You
yeah.
got it.
Well, Dane, this has been really great. I really appreciate your time and answering all these questions. So,
Yeah, of
thank you for
course.
being with us today.
My pleasure. It was a blast.